Well, welcome to the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies. Very pleased to have you here for our regular Wednesday lecture. And it's our great privilege to welcome Mr. Graham Robb, who will be speaking on persecution and French national identity. As you probably know, but we'll let you know a little bit more about him. He is here as part of a conference on 19th century France, sponsored by the Department of French here at BYU. He is also available on Thursday at noon in 284 of the Tanner Building for a question and answer session on his book, The Discovery of France, which I'm sure you'll want to come to that as well. Excuse me. But again, we're very pleased to welcome him to campus and looking forward to his comments here at the Kennedy Center today. For those of you who are regulars here at the Kennedy Center, you know of all the events that are going on and how to keep on top. But for those who may be here for the first time, if I can just mention that the lecture flyers and the information about all the lectures is available very easily accessible online. Our website, kennedy.byu.edu, where not only you can see the calendar of upcoming lectures, you can also download previous lectures on video or MP3. We have an RSS feed, we have a Twitter feed, we have a Facebook page, and we actually have lectures in person. So you can come here and hopefully you will come back and make these opportunities to enrich your education a regular part of your BYU experience. A couple of other upcoming events that I just wanted to mention. This Friday here at 10 a.m. we'll be hosting Mona Hamdi, who's Executive Director of the Mosaic Foundation. She'll be speaking on Arab women, perception, and reality. If that didn't get you, she is compiling a series of essays about prominent Arab women called Bikinis and Burqas, The Power, Passion, and Politics of Modern Arab Women. She's a very interesting speaker and will be here on campus as part of a guest from Farms. Our Middle East Studies Arabic program will be hosting the lecture, and we'd encourage you to come by Friday at 10. And then hopefully everyone has heard about this, so this is a repeat. Next Tuesday at 11 a.m. as part of the University Forum, we'll be hosting our Book of the Semester lecture. As you know, each semester we select an author whose work we think speaks to an important international theme or topic that will bring together different departments and people across campus. We've invited Greg Mortensen, whose book 3 Cups of Tea most have heard about. He will be speaking as part of the University Forum series at 11 o'clock. That's in the Marriott Center, so there'll be plenty of seats. I can mention to those of you who are the faithful lecture-going crowd that we do have a few floor seat tickets available. If you're interested to get a reserved floor seat at the forum. After the lecture's over today, please just see me out in the foyer, and we'll see how many of those we've got. So we've got a few left. You'd have to get there before the hour, so at least 5 to 11 next Tuesday, but that would allow you to get down onto the floor and be a little bit closer. We're expecting a very large crowd. The forums tend to draw good crowds already, but we've been getting calls and emails and notices from people all across the state who are coming. I think every book club in the state of Utah is coming. So that's great. We're looking forward to an exciting event with Mr. Greg Mortensen, and encourage you, if you haven't, to take a look at the book. And if you missed the panel discussion last week, that's also available online. Again, very pleased and honored to welcome Mr. Robb with us today. We'd like to start off, as is our custom, with an opening prayer. We've asked Ashley Neff, who's an English major from San Jose, California, to offer that prayer. And then I'd like to turn the time over to Professor Corey Cropper, who's the chair of the French department and one of the organizers of the conference that brings Mr. Robb to Utah this week, to introduce our speaker today. Ashley?
Dear Heavenly Father, we're thankful to be here today and to hear a lecture from Mr. Graham Robb. We ask Thee to please help us to have Thy Spirit to be with us, that we may learn from him what he has to say. Please bless him that he will be able to convey his knowledge to the best of his ability. And we say this in the name of Thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Well, Corey, I'm going to do what I can, and Graham, to get your book into book clubs. I'll recommend it to my wife's book club and see if she will take up the challenge. Graham Robb, got his PhD here in the U.S. at Vanderbilt in French literature. He worked on Baudelaire. His doctoral thesis, I think, right, was on Baudelaire.
That's right.
Baudelaire and Balzac. He published a book on Baudelaire and has published a number of biographies in addition to Baudelaire, on Hugo, Balzac, Rimbaud, and has won numerous literary awards for those. His most recent book is called The Discovery of France, a historical geography from the Revolution to the First World War, and it came out in 2007. Graham wrote this book in part by going to every single small library. If you look at the bibliography of this book, he's been to all the small museums and libraries across France, and he visited many of them by cycling. I believe you did something like 14,000 miles across France for that book. And so we're happy that he's made his way here. I don't think he rode all the way, but he did. But we're glad he's here, and we hope to get him up in the mountains riding a little bit while he's here, too. And we're happy to have him here. His speech today is entitled Persecution in French National Identity. Please help me welcome Dr. Graham Robb.
Well, thanks very much for that very kind introduction, and I'm delighted to be asked to contribute to this lecture series. I'm sorry to express my appreciation by talking about such an unpleasant subject. I think the pedagogical term for the talk I'm going to give would be under-theorized, but then the poet Baudelaire said that a theory is a form of damnation, a selling of one's intellectual soul. So I'll innocently and simply present a certain number of verifiable and perhaps not very well-known historical and contemporary facts, and then suggest how they might be related and what they might tell us about France today. In fact, I'll just make that suggestion now, and that is that a sense of national or regional identity is bound up, at least in the part of the far western Asian isthmus known as France, with the desire to identify and punish a minority group, and that the nation sometimes asserts itself not just in a state of educated mind or in a constitution or in public celebrations and monuments, but also in active persecution. My first example goes back to the time when France was still a group of very diverse provinces, in some ways less cohesive than they had been in ancient Gaul, before the Romans imposed their own forms of regional identity. It concerns a group of people called the Cagle, C-A-G-O-T, who lived, and some say still live, in southwestern France, in a region roughly corresponding to medieval Gascony, or going further back in time to the Roman province of Aquitania. However, there were also Cagle in Brittany and the Vendée, which means that they could be found usually in sunless suburbs or in hamlets on marshy ground, in a fairly wide strip running all the way down the Atlantic coast. And there were also some large groups in northwestern Spain, corresponding in part to what's now called the Basque Country. Now, until about 5 years ago, I knew nothing whatsoever about the Cagle and hadn't even heard of them. No general history of France mentions them, and very few people in France know that they existed, even in the regions where they used to be common. And yet there's a huge amount of documentary, anecdotal, anthropological, and even architectural evidence of their existence. These days, you can still discover the traces of this mysterious group in certain towns and villages in the foothills of the Pyrenees on the border with Spain, where some of the churches have separate doors, sometimes right next to the main entrance, and small outside fonts, which are often right next to the water trough for animals that people would leave outside the church when they went in. These special entrances and fonts were intended for the Cagle. The idea was that they shouldn't sully the holy water that was used by the rest of the congregation. And once inside the church, they had to sit on special benches along the side. When they took communion, the host was held out to them by the priest on the end of a stick. They weren't allowed to walk barefoot anywhere in public and weren't allowed to touch the parapets of bridges. The persecution softened slightly over time, but it survived every political and religious change for almost 1,000 years. The church at the small town of Navarrance, which still has a Cagle door, though it isn't used anymore, changed from Catholic to Protestant, back to Catholic, but remained consistent in its segregation of Cagle. In the 18th century, slightly further north, a wealthy Cagle was seen taking water from the wrong font and had his hand sliced off by a soldier and nailed to the church door. And the soldier wasn't punished for that. In 1741, another Cagle who cultivated the soil, and that was another prohibition, had his feet pierced with red-hot iron spikes. On the eve of the Revolution, 1789, there were still priests who refused to bury Cagle with other Christians. The only advantage to being a Cagle until the 17th century was that since their money was considered unclean, they paid no taxes, and since they weren't allowed to carry arms, they were excused military service. Even in the 19th century, after the Revolution, the prejudice was virulent, though mostly confined to the peasantry or the proletariat. The first Cagle to become a mayor was forced out of office in 1830. A baker at Hennebont in Brittany married a Cagle girl and overnight lost all his working-class customers. And in fact, there are quite recent examples of the prejudice, mostly children who are victimized at school and people who consider themselves Cagle but don't want the fact to be known. And some of that I only found out after I published The Discovery of France. The obvious, but perhaps not the right question is, who were they, or who are they? After a few magazine articles appeared on the subject in the early 19th century, some erudite tourists went in search of the cursed race and managed to detect some revealing features. The Cagle was said to be unusually short and to suffer from webbed fingers and toes. Someone masquerading as a scientific person published data on the prevalence of missing earlobes, which is a very obscure form of prejudice. They were also said to have yellowish skin, bright blue or olive-coloured eyes, and even more bizarrely, ingrowing toenails. In fact, I hardly need to say these bogus identifications of racial or genetic features simply repeated some of the ancient prejudices, though by the 19th century no one claimed any more, at least not in print, that Cagles bled from the navel on Good Friday. There were and still are all sorts of theories about the origin of the Cagle, none of which are provable or even plausible. Most have actually been disproved. They were said to be descended from lepers who came back from the Crusades, but there were leper colonies long before the first cagoteries or Cagle ghettos, and later the two groups were explicitly distinguished. The Parliament of Bordeaux decreed in 1578 that lepers were to carry a rattle and Cagle were to wear a red sign on the breast in the form of a duck's foot. Others said that they were very early Christians who'd been persecuted by the pagans and then still persecuted after the whole country had been Christianized. Inevitably, they've also been associated with the Cathar heretics who were hunted down in the Albigensian Crusades of the 13th century. But there were Cagle long before there were Cathar, and they practiced entirely orthodox forms of Christianity. The real problem is that the distribution of Cagle in Western France is not primarily a population pattern, but the footprint of a prejudice. And perhaps official tolerance of the prejudice in certain administrative areas was the biggest factor. And this is, if I can be slightly callous about it for a moment, a beautiful example of persecution. Nothing distinguished the Cagle from the rest of the population except the fact that they were persecuted. Anyone who came from a family of Cagle was considered to be one of them, which is why at the time of the Revolution, certain groups of Cagle stormed municipal buildings to destroy their birth records. Naturally, local memory kept the prejudice alive, and there were some very long rhyming songs passed on from one generation to the next, which preserved the names of Cagle families. And even today, an anthropologist has shown that people who are descended from Cagle families still tend to intermarry and to practice typically Cagle professions such as carpentry and midwifery, even though they've never heard of Cagle. Communities where they were found seem to have been united in their hatred, and it may be significant, though it would be impossible to prove the connection, and there are many possible reasons for this, that there are fewer examples of the sort of inter-village, inter-tribal violence and warfare that was prevalent in other parts of France. Perhaps, too, in the isolated hamlets of Brittany, the swamps of Poitou, and the impervious villages of the Pyrenees, the population suffered, as it were, from a lack of obvious outsiders or religious dissenters. The Jewish population, for example, was almost non-existent. There is, though, today a small museum, or rather a display, devoted to the Cagle in the little tourist town of Arreau, which the Tour de France bicycle race often visits. And this is a development that seems to be characteristic of the treatment of past prejudices in France. Instead of drawing attention to the cruelty and injustice that were meted out to a perfectly harmless group of people, the town museum adopts the old notion that they were unusually short, hobbit-like creatures, and equates them with the little people of the mountains who were persecuted by the evil aristocrats, until, that is, the advent of the Republic. It seems that in the realm of persecution, and even in different circumstances, attempted genocide, horrors eventually acquire a picturesque appearance. The most enormous acts of institutional savagery can be forgotten almost as soon as they're committed, and certainly while they're being committed, as we know from the inhabitants of the peaceful little town of Dachau. Cagle, of course, are not the only persecuted minority in French or Gallic history. One of Napoleon Bonaparte's lesser-known achievements, or perhaps an achievement of his administration, was to single out a group of people on ethnic grounds and to ban them from the country. These people were the Bohemians, or Gypsies, who were thought to be responsible for all sorts of crimes, though interestingly, according to one contemporary source, not by the common people, who missed them and their services when they were sent away. Even as late as 1857, there was an article by a man who evidently considered himself enlightened, saying that despite the large number of complaints, he still wasn't entirely convinced that gypsies went in for cannibalism. The exclusion of gypsies took place in 1803. Secret plans were drawn up. All the gypsies were to be rounded up on a certain day and deported to the north coast of Africa. War prevented that from happening, and so instead it was decided that all gypsy families would be split up. The women and children and the old would be sent to the poorhouse. Young men would be allowed to join the army or the navy, and adult men would be sentenced to forced labour. There was also a proposal to resettle them in barren, unproductive, malarial parts of France, where they would cultivate the desert, and anyone who strayed more than 4 leagues, or about 10 miles from his assigned spot, would be sent to prison. As with the Cagle, it's almost impossible to find any reference to this in any general history of France. And that's particularly interesting since the word cigane, or gypsy, is still a politically emotive word in France. Now, what does this have to do with national identity? Well, I'm not entirely certain, except that it is one of the first examples in the history of post-revolutionary France of a desire by the state to protect the fatherland from the incursions and depredations of nomads. Nomads who, in this case, were strongly attached to particular regions and places, and who were far less nomadic than the millions of seasonal labourers. And of course, the Jews, too, no matter how settled and how long established, were considered in some sense nomadic. It's one of the first signs of an official division of the population along racial or ethnic grounds, ignoring whatever valuable services the group in question might provide. And it's probably worth saying that in 1803, the men who governed France were still reeling from the shock of discovering that France as a nation barely existed. It was shortly after the Revolution when the National Assembly realized that their democratic decrees were incomprehensible to many French citizens. They conducted a survey and found to their horror that the official idiom of the French Republic was a minority language. Only about 11% of the population could be considered pure French speakers. And this was almost certainly an underestimate. Even much later in 1880, the number of French citizens who felt comfortable speaking French was put at about 8 million, or just over 1/5 of the population. And doctors, policemen, and administrators, like colonial officials, were often forced to use interpreters. As the man who devised the survey concluded, "In liberty we are the advance guard of nations. In language we are still at the Tower of Babel." And Napoleon himself knew, or found out, that the French nation was more a political than a linguistic, cultural, or ideological whole. He knew from the years of military conscription that the inhabitants of certain provinces were extremely reluctant to fight for what they refused to see as the fatherland. They associated it, the state or the republic, as many people still do, with Paris and its domestic empire. When Napoleon was deposed for the first time in 1814 and taken down by the British through France to the Mediterranean, he was cheered in some towns and nearly lynched in others. And before he boarded the ship for the island of Elba, he had a piece of advice for the restored King Louis XVIII. He should rule the country like a tyrant, said Napoleon, or he'll never be able to do anything with it. I think there's some later, more benign echo of this in General de Gaulle's famous complaint, "How can anyone be expected to govern a country that has 246 different kinds of cheese?" Which was later inflated to 1 cheese for every day of the year. And he said this during a trip to the United States, actually. It was reported in Time magazine, which I think shows that it was really a sly attempt to promote the international commercial interests of French cheesemakers, who are a very powerful political body. Now, perhaps the most significant thing, as with the Cagle, is the fact that this mass expulsion of gypsies, considered as a tribe or a race, has been expunged from French history, or rather, since there's been no deliberate conspiracy, simply not seen or not remembered, and evidently not deemed an event of particular significance, except presumably in gypsy communities. As a parallel to this, in the decades-long silence about the collaboration and zeal of the Vichy government in the Second World War in carrying out and indeed anticipating the desires of their Nazi superiors. Thanks largely to the French translation of the work of the American historian and Oxford Rhodes scholar Robert Paxton, the silence was eventually broken, but it still hangs over the town of Vichy itself, where it's almost impossible to find any allusion to what went on there. So when was the French nation united? Perhaps in war, but then many people had no idea who the Prussians were in 1870, and in 1914 few people understood why they were going to fight the Germans. And even in the Second World War, as we know, France hardly presented a united front to the Nazis. So perhaps then the nation was united in division, or at least divided into 2 united camps by the Dreyfus affair, when a Jewish army captain was wrongly accused of espionage. Now, I'm certainly not saying that anything good came of this ugly and protracted affair. It tends, though, to be remembered now for the heroic action of Émile Zola, and not quite so well remembered for the even more heroic behaviour of his wife, who stayed behind in Paris to organise the campaign to free Captain Dreyfus. Zola, who was buried with the great men and one woman, Marie Curie, of the fatherland in the Pantheon in Paris, is seen as one of the brightest beacons of the enlightened Republic. And yet the Dreyfus affair was a crucial event in the development of a French national identity, in part because so much of the population was united against Dreyfus and for the fatherland. Now, it's impossible here, as in any period of history, to match up all the good causes with the good effects and the bad with the bad and place them all in separate camps. The people with the strongest sense of national identity were the anti-Dreyfusards. And it's worth noticing that many of them weren't just anti-Semitic. They were quite convinced that Captain Dreyfus was innocent and had been wrongly arrested. But they also thought that he must be found guilty for the good of the nation. Now, my final example is equally depressing, but also, I hope, more cheering. Perhaps now more than ever, a sense of French national identity is bound up with what can most kindly be called the neglect of a certain group of people. I'm thinking of the riots that broke out in the suburbs of Paris, in the banlieue, in 2005 and quickly spread to 273 other towns. The cause of the riots, as everyone who lived in the suburbs knew, was the brutality of the police. When I had a labouring job in Paris in the late 1970s, the Arabs I knew always carried photocopies of their identity papers because the police would stop them in the street, ask to see their papers, and then rip them up because they knew how hard it was to get them in the first place. And that was a relatively minor inconvenience, yet another forgotten event of French history, though it's now commemorated by a very discreet little plaque that's quite hard to find on the Pont Saint-Michel in the centre of Paris, is the murder of about 200 peacefully protesting Algerians by the Paris police in October 1961. Some were drowned in the Seine by the Pont Saint-Michel. Many others were tortured and maimed. Today, things have improved, and the violence tends to take the form of public humiliation. Now, the ostensible immediate cause of the riots in 2005 was the death by electrocution of two young boys. One of them was black African, the other was a Tunisian, and a third boy who survived was Turkish. All three were French citizens. They'd been running away from the police and took refuge in an electricity substation. They hadn't committed a crime, they'd been playing football, but they knew that the police would search them, perhaps manhandle them, and certainly insult them. And they didn't want to be late home for their evening meal because their parents were very strict about such things. The police saw them climbing into the substation, but they didn't call the fire brigade and eventually drove away, one of them saying, literally, and there's a recording of it, "I wouldn't give much for their skin if they stay in there." Now, their deaths were the immediate cause of the riots, but the situation wasn't helped by the fact that the night before, on television, the Ministry of the Interior, a man of Hungarian extraction called Nicolas Sarkozy, had called the young inhabitants of the deprived northern suburbs racailles, or scum. And this was partly because his public relations firm had devised a kind of test where members of the public would be invited and given joysticks and then played recordings of Nicolas Sarkozy's speeches. And if they agreed with something very strongly, they jerked the joystick to the right, and if they thought it wasn't a particularly good thing, they jerked it to the left. And the word racaille had produced a significant jerk to the right, which is why it starts appearing in his speeches quite frequently. Now, for many French people who don't live in the suburbs, the banlieusards constitute a very particular group, identified by colour and, increasingly, religion. A fantasy image has been created of the people of the banlieue, which doesn't correspond at all to the reality. If you go there today, to the parts where the Troubles began in 2005, and if you compare it to certain districts of some British and American cities, it looks like the scene of a promotional film for home buyers and investors. You see black Africans, North Africans and white people all sharing the same space. And as in most parts of France, teenagers hanging about on street corners tend to be exquisitely polite to strangers. It's possibly connected with the fact that my wife was wearing the bicycle cap of a French cycling team. This would simply not be believed by many French people, and especially by the millions who vote for the far-right National Front. But they're not the only ones. A rather distinguished writer and broadcaster from French radio, Dominique Bomberger, told me recently that he'd gone to live for a few months in the slum suburb of Clichy-sous-Bois as a kind of explorer or ethnologist. Clichy-sous-Bois is where the two boys were electrocuted. by chance, he went to live there a few months before the riots began and wrote an account of his time there. And when it was published, he sent it to several of his friends and didn't hear back from any of them. And when he phoned one of them to ask if he'd read the book, the friend said he wasn't going to read a book about Algerians. It often surprises foreign visitors how openly people in France will express racist views, almost as a form of friendliness to the person who is expected to share them. I once said to a Sorbonne professor, a man born in Paris, who wasn't at all a racist, but was complaining about the poor performance of France in international sport. I said, but France won the World Cup, the soccer World Cup. France, he said derisively, putting enormous inverted commas around the word. When I stupidly failed to understand, he explained that the majority of the national football team were of North African or African, or in one case, New Caledonian descent, though they were all children of the Republic, and some of them had been born in the dreaded suburbs of Paris. It seems to me that this is something different from, for example, the attacks on Italian immigrant workers in the early 20th century. Nowadays, there's a more intellectual aspect to the hatred. It has something to do with economic concerns, but far more, to judge by the rhetoric of the National Front, with competing views of what France is or should be. Merely to talk about French national identity in France is to talk about racism. In this case, a sense of national identity seems to be positively harmful, and President Sarkozy gained far too many votes from the National Front to try to incorporate the banlieue into his vision of France. But there are reasons to hope that something good will come of this. Ironically, one of the best analyses of the riots can be found in a confidential report prepared by the Police Intelligence Service. According to them, the Troubles had nothing to do with race, country of origin, or religion. There were no gangs and no terrorists involved. It had nothing to do with Muslim fundamentalism. The violence was entirely spontaneous. This was not juvenile delinquency. It was, according to the police intelligence report, an urban insurrection and a popular revolt. In other words, it was the expression of a great French national tradition, one of the defining features of the First, Second, Third, and Fifth Republics. As far as I know, the rioters didn't actually sing the Marseillaise, except perhaps in a rap version. But they did gather on certain evenings in the Place de la Bastille, which suggests that the banlieusards too have a strong and probably more historically accurate sense of national identity. I told you it was a bit depressing.
We have time for questions, so please raise your hand and wait for the microphone, and tell us your name and what you're studying as well.
My name is Philip Lushin. I want to get into the business school. I have a question about how you started your research for the Cagle, because you said it's a forgotten part of French history, and how you found out about them, and then how you started your search.
It was, I first found out about them by reading the articles that were written by 19th century scholars or explorers who went to that part of France and heard stories about the Cagle, and then started trying to find out by talking to local people. And there is quite a lot of material. The problem with a lot of historical material is that it's warped by the prejudices of the time, of course, and a lot of it was of a popular nature, for popular consumption. So you have to put a certain amount of it together to get an accurate picture. So it's partly that, but also once I found out about it, I went to various towns and villages in that part of France, and you just look at almost any church in certain regions, and then you can see the evidence of the Cagle in those churches. And quite often, a local historian, who is often the local priest, will have done work in local archives and discovered things that aren't available elsewhere and that don't tend to be visible or that aren't taken seriously because it's seen as local amateur history. So those were the two starting points. And since then, there was also the anthropologist I've mentioned who went and interviewed people whom she knew from looking at the records to be descended from the Cagle, and discovered that even though they hadn't heard of the Cagle, they perpetuated certain customs and traditions and the segregation. I mean, I realised if I talked on a subject other than national identity, it could have been a much more cheerful and positive talk about France. But it is interesting that, in contrast to America, if you talk about national identity, you do come up with a very negative picture. And France has, since before the Romans, been able to integrate very different populations speaking different languages.
Hi, I'm Robert Hudson in French and Italian. I want to combine your studies a little bit with Corey Cropper's and ask about this question of North Africans and even West Africans in the Parisian banlieue. I've read a few articles, and for some reason I can't remember who the sociologist was who wrote an article about the Zidane effect, the positive effect of North African and West African, even Caribbean players on the French national team. It's similar to what we've seen maybe with African Americans in the NBA and with Latino Americans in Major League Baseball, where there's a more positive image and heroes being founded in that. But then on the other side, there's also, I can't remember the journalist, Corey might be able to help me with this, that told Joe Jacoby, the Washington Redskins offensive guard, that he was nothing but a caged beast. So you have two sides. Is that who it was? Okay. You have two sides of the argument. You have the positive side that these racial boundaries and these former prejudices are being effaced by sports figures, and you have this other side that are these sport figures only these gladiators that are brought out at specific times that we really want to separate from the main front. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, it's very interesting, the parallels. I think it's very difficult to generalize, but I think part of what's happened in France is that the Zidane effect, where people felt pride that the French national team was more representative of their France than it had been in the past, brought extremists out into the open more, so that once you had, no one could publicly disagree. They were all glad that France had won the World Cup. But it brought things out into the open more. And I think that's partly why there is more hope now, that when the situation becomes extreme, the solutions in some ways become simpler, because there isn't that same complexity of prejudice anymore. And that's partly why I wanted to mention the fact that if you go to the banlieue, there is, racially and religiously, it's very difficult to identify particular neighborhoods which are Muslim or West African. Obviously there are groups, but it's not it's not a ghettoization in the same way. So I think probably overall it had a positive effect, but not really on French football, because they're all a bit too old and retiring. Someone over here.
I'm David McDonald. I'm a French studies major. I had a question about the Cagle. At the time of the revolution, they were still being heavily persecuted, obviously, if they rushed into the records to try to destroy them. Yeah. How were they eventually integrated back or into society in a way that they were no longer recognized as Cagle and persecuted? Because today you say that they don't even realize maybe that that's their past and they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to be known.
Yes, most people apparently don't recognize themselves as Cagle, but it's very hard to say exactly. I think one possible reason is simply the opening up of that part of France, because the Pyrenees were very isolated, and certainly totally isolated for 6 months of the year by snow, and so there simply wasn't all that much contact with the outside world, and prejudices are always able to thrive more easily in small village communities. So I would expect that that's part of the reason it started to disappear. And then eventually education, the rational republic, explaining that we're all French citizens, we're all part of the French Republic. Yes. But it's hard to say. It's almost, but it's also hard to say how lasted 1,000 years, or at least 1,000 years.
Hi, I'm James Perkins. I'm a history major. This is a somewhat convoluted question, but I'm wondering, you mentioned this difference when you were talking to a professor at the Sorbonne about how he was characterizing France versus kind of how the whole nation was trying to imagine and personify itself. And I'm wondering if there's this tradition of Orientalism and Japanisme and really romancing the other in French intellectual circles, such as through Rimbaud and through different writers and intellectuals up to Sartre and de Beauvoir. I'm wondering how that plays out with the general public sphere, whereas they seem very comfortable to romance something that's outside of France, but once it comes into France, there's a bit of a problem.
Well, it's like all good questions, like your question. It's effectively unanswerable. But I think you're right to draw attention to the fact that there was a romanticization in France of North Africa in particular by painters and writers. And I suppose that predates virulent anti-North African prejudice in France by more than half a century. In fact, almost a century. I think the two things are quite clearly dissociated in the French mind. I don't think there's much interference of the Romantic view, the Orientalist view, with the current view, at least not in popular perceptions of the inhabitants of the banlieue. I think it has more to do now with looking for scapegoats and blaming particular groups for particular kinds of action. But you're right to draw attention to that. And I don't think your question is convoluted. I think the answers to it are inevitably convoluted because it's very difficult to find them. Of course, the problem that historians don't have, which governments do, is that they have to find practical solutions to those problems. I suppose it would be interesting, I'm sure it's being done, it would be interesting to see how much that Romantic Orientalism affected perceptions of the French football team. There was a certain amount of storytelling about the player of New Caledonian descent, because it turned out he had been related to a tribal leader who led a revolt against the French when they were using some of the New Caledonian islands as penal colonies. And this came up shortly before the time of the World Cup because it was discovered that the French had decapitated the tribal leader when they defeated the Africans and taken the head back to Paris as an ethnological exhibit and put it in a museum. And so the New Caledonians wanted it back so that it could be properly buried, and he was there, a great historical freedom fighter, and the head couldn't be found. And it was interesting how the French press reported this as a kind of 19th century, slightly quirky, slightly amusing Orientalist tale. Even the people who wanted to restore the remains of their tribal leader to their proper resting place. Just shows what a terrible thing football is, really. Soccer.
My name is Janae, and my major is French Studies. And I'm curious, culturally, to the French, what defines a Frenchman, a true Frenchman?
I don't want to answer. You're chair of a French department. Actually, one thing that probably comes up most often is a reference to Vercingetorix, or Vercingetorix, who was leader of the Gauls. He was the French freedom fighter against the Romans. And the description of the true Frenchman is often related to Julius Caesar's description of the Gauls, that they're impetuous and proud, courageous in battle, and they don't like being told what to do. There's sort of opposition to the centralizing government of empires such as Rome or now Paris, since Paris is seen as a kind of imperial colonial power in many parts of France. So it's that, I mean, impetuosity is the quality that's most often mentioned. And the Vercingetorix idea is in some ways at the heart of the French identity also, because there's a very strong cultural identification in France with the Romans. Civilization, Mediterranean civilization, enjoying the pleasures of life in a civilized fashion. And all the way through there's, do we identify with the Gauls, who were barbarians, or do we identify with the Romans, who were invaders and conquered France and were quite cruel in their conquest? The person who enjoys cheese, I suppose, is also important.
My name is Madeline Glebe. I'm an international relations major, and I was just wondering, this brings to mind the recent law that was passed prohibiting headscarves for Muslim women.
Oh, yeah.
And I was just wondering how effective measures like that are in establishing like a French identity, and how receptive people are to them, and I guess just what sort of conflicts they've caused recently.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think it's surprising in a way that at that time, after the riots, the French government would be so hardline about such an emotive issue. And it's partly because of the ideals of the Republic, that education should be entirely separate from religion, from the church, which of course goes back to the Revolution. So it's that. I think that was seen as a symbol of modern French education. Now we have to take a stand and we have to say French education is still secular and church and state are still completely separate. I think there's also, since there are lots of other ways in which a discrimination against French Muslims could have been expressed, it's also, it's men in power telling women what they can wear and what they can't wear. So I think there's also that. And it may have more to do, or there may be more interesting things to say about the position of women in French society and the governmental view of women in French society than about the question of Islam in France. But it's a subject that really ought to be gone into a lot more than it has been, probably.
My name is Griffin Olson. I'm in Middle Eastern Studies, and I'm just wondering, what do you see as the future for local identities such and languages like Breton or Gascon and other, local identities?
Yes. Well, it looks like they have a very bright future. There's no example in France quite as spectacular as the example of Welsh in the United Kingdom, where Welsh almost died out and then was brought back in, and now it's the national language, and you have to speak French if you take a civil service job in Wales or a university job, and that's been tremendously successful. Breton is still widely spoken, and it could certainly be revived officially more than it has been, and lots of other regions have discovered that what they speak is a separate language. That very often now, if you ask people what they speak or you talk to people about their local idiom, they'll describe it as patois or dialect and won't necessarily realise that it's actually separate from French, and sometimes even separate from the group of dialects to which standard French belongs. There is a slight contradiction in terms, but there is a government, what is it called, the Ministry of Decentralisation. So there is a deliberate central Parisian policy to devolve more power to the regions. But I think it has a very bright future. And what you still find, or what one often still finds in certain regions of France that have very particular histories, is a very strong sense of regional identity. The only problem is that often that regional identity is constructed in opposition to Parisians. And in many parts of France, to say Parisien is a form of insult. It's not a kind thing to say about someone.
One more.
My name is Ian Esplin, and I'm an accounting major. I'm wondering, from your research, what you foresee in France. Do you have an optimistic outlook as far as the race issue in France, or a negative one?
I think, well, the first thing that strikes me is that if you write a general book about France, it then becomes very easy to dig yourself deeper and deeper into subjects about which you know practically nothing. And one of those subjects is the future in all its forms. But I think things are improving. I mean, it's now generally accepted that it's the problems of France aren't due to particular groups of people. And there's a much more international view of things, and even if it's a protectionist view. And I think just the fact that so many people live in the suburbs of Paris, for example, not in ghettos, suggests that things are getting better. I think, as with so many other things, it's just going to depend on economic conditions to a large extent. Because one of the main problem with the banlieue was simply that there was almost no funding in the banlieue by government, and then the usual problems arose that arise from deprivation and neglect. And it's funny because the last time I was there, the hotel I was staying in, I went down in the morning, there was a copy of the local paper talking about how much American investment, private American investment there had been in the banlieue of Paris. And it was seen as a good cause, but also as very fertile ground for investors. And the obviously correct idea was that actually there was a lot more interest from certain investors than there appeared to be from the French government. Thank you.